Instructional Designers in Offices Drinking Coffee is brought to you by Domino, makers of Domino One, the all-in-one, cloud-based e-learning authoring tool for teams. You can learn more at domino.com. Now, here's this week's episode.
Oh yeah, excellent. There we go. Good morning, everybody. That's our morning Wednesday song kicking in, and we're getting weather reports from all over the globe.
Yep, apparently there's weather everywhere today. Another surprising fact we didn't know.
You go figure. It looks like the chat room is firing up the dance moves too. Way to go, chat room. Thanks for hanging. And
very, very, very cool. Well, you know that old saying, no matter where you go, there you are.
And there's weather.
And there's weather. There's going to be weather.
We're off to a rough start this morning.
Chad's rubbing it in. It's another nice morning in Tucson, Arizona. Yeah, we know Arizona. We know Arizona gets the nice weather.
We do have the nice weather, for sure. It's a beautiful day today. I totally hear you, Chad. Phoenix is feeling good too. But Chris, we got something important to talk about today, and we have a very special guest to talk about it with. Who we got with us today?
Folks, we have Maria Marukian joining us for the first time ever here on Idiotic. Maria, introduce yourself to our friends and our folks in the chat so they can get to know you a little bit.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm so happy to be here with you and really looking forward to our conversation today. So thanks for having me on the show, Chris and Brent.
You are very welcome. And clever positioning, because the thing that we've come here to talk about, or the thing that's given us a reason to get together to talk about, is that you do have a book out this spring with ATD Press called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Trainers. And that's what we're going to dig into here today. Maybe just let's start with how you got into this topic area. What brought you into it? What gave this a reason for this to be important enough to you to actually put together the time and energy, etc., and expertise to actually put a book together on that front? Where did it come from?
I will give you a little bit of the sort of the professional background and then the personal background, because I think both are equally important. So I've been in the sort of the profession of diversity, equity, and inclusion for about 18 years. My background's in organizational behavior, organizational culture, always bringing a focus on intercultural understanding, diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice issues. And so I've spent the last 18 years as a trainer, coach, instructional designer. I've worked, I'm based in Washington, D.C. So of course, much of my work has been in and around federal government. I've also worked with the nonprofit community and with the private sector. And really always with a lens on how to infuse these principles of understanding the complexity of us as human beings, right? So that we can be better in our organization, so that we can thrive and we can ensure that others thrive too. The personal side of this for me, I think it really, growing up, I grew up in the outskirts, the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, lived on the surface a very sort of prototypical white middle class American life. I had two working parents who were both public school teachers. So, lots of advantages in terms of a focus on education and opportunities. I was, always very kind of comfortable, always knew that I was going to go to college, all of those opportunities that come with being, to be quite honest, being white and having some element of wealth in America. And yet there was always this undercurrent of difference as I was growing up too. I grew up in a multicultural family. My father's side of the family were immigrants, were refugees. My father's mother, my grandmother, had to take her family, her mother, her sisters, her children, and flee from Turkey during the Armenian genocide, and which coincidentally, we just celebrated Armenian Remembrance Day on Sunday. So that was kind of meaningful for me to be able to acknowledge everything that my family's gone through. And at the time, they weren't able to join other members of the family in the United States because of quotas for refugees. And so they landed in Cuba. And my father was actually born and raised in Cuba, and he was Varujan, the Armenian-speaking son at home, and Florentino, the Spanish-speaking kid in school and on the streets of Cuba. And then as a young man, he and his family came to the United States and started all over again as refugees, try to hold on to this culture that was really important to them, this identity that was really important to them, and at the same time, adapt and assimilate, learn the new language, try to make a life for himself. And he married my mother, who grew up in a farming community in northern Michigan of about 300 people who for generations all spoke Polish. And so I had this really interesting multilingual, multicultural upbringing that even, superficially, and I present and identify as white American, but I also recognized the importance of understanding the depth of the stories that people bring with them, and how that impacts how we see the world, how we see ourselves, what we value, and acknowledging that all of us bring these stories of joy and resilience and hardship and grief with us. And, in order for us to do this work, to be effective in our societies and our organizations, we have to acknowledge that we are all unique, multifaceted people. So I know that was a long intro, but I think it's important to understand some of that context because storytelling is such an important part of DEI work.
Yeah, and that's such an amazing, set of, points along a journey. Such a very cool combination, really, of different backgrounds and cultures all merging into your own family. That's very cool. So swinging back though to our professional lives, etc. Certainly, DEI has had a fairly high prominence on the radar in the last few years, etc. What would be some of the starting points which people should start thinking about doing if they haven't maybe even put in a formal DEI policy in place or something like that? Where do folks get started on making sure that this critical aspect of making sure that we're bringing everybody together, helping everybody prosper and succeed together in organizations? Where are some of the places where we can start with that?
Yeah, there is so much work to be done. And although, yes, diversity, equity, inclusion is not a new topic. Obviously, we've been struggling with these questions and these issues at a societal level, at a systemic level for many, many years. And yet we have this renewed focus and almost a social demand, right? It's not just, we need to, put some effort into this. It is increasingly being seen as a moral imperative. So I think that's really important in terms of the timing and the renewed sense of focus over the last couple of years. So, for many organizations that I've been working with over the last 2 years, there has been, there are a lot of organizations that have come forth and said, we don't have anything in place. Where do we begin, right? We care about this. We want to do better. We recognize that we have some work to do, but we are not exactly sure what the next step should be. And oftentimes what is either explicitly or implicitly communicated in that too is we're scared we're going to get it wrong and we will be judged for it. And so one of the things that I always start with is you have to get leadership on board, right? This has to be something that is driven from the senior most positions in the organization. Not that the sole responsibility lies with senior leaders and executives. There needs to be that grassroots effort. And yet, if we don't have true, authentic commitment and visible commitment from the top, it sometimes feels like window dressing. And I think a lot of individuals in the organizations that I've worked with have recognized that we have to start with leadership. The other thing that, especially for folks who are in instructional design, training, talent development, starting with assessment, understanding where you are today, not just in terms of policies and practices that support DEI, but also how are people talking about and responding to the organizational culture, which can sometimes feel kind of ambiguous, but who's having what experiences and why is a really important starting point, rather than saying, we need to do something, let's call in an expert and do unconscious bias training and then all done, right? It's more so about looking internally, introspectively, where are we as an organization in terms of our strengths and how we are supporting the needs of our diverse employees, stakeholder groups outside of our workforce, and where do we have some room to grow in terms of representation, in terms of ensuring that this is an organizational culture where everybody feels like they have a sense of belonging, that they're valued for the unique characteristics, qualities, skills they bring with them, and that we're making equitable decisions in terms of career advancement, professional development, so on and so forth. So I think that assessment piece is intensely critical for folks in training and instructional design.
Since that's our starting point, and I know there's more to it that we're going to get to, but maybe we could just drop down 1 or 2 levels, and if you could, maybe give us some examples, because I think there might be some folks thinking, yes, I kind of get that whole assessment thing, but what do I look for? Like, are we looking for data from the HR database that says we've got a certain number of, these ethnicities working for us, or maybe we have manufacturing facilities in these countries, and so you have to be aware of this? Or are we talking cultural things we need to be sensitive to? Or are we looking for people who have had issues and they've reported people for not being diverse and not being inclusive and whatnot? And then, is there a simple way to kind of rank where somebody is when they're starting off? Maybe that's what I'm asking for. Like, everybody wants that silver bullet, right? That easy button, right? How do we, is there a way to kind of figure out where we're starting?
The short answer to that question is yes.
Oh,
excellent.
Yeah. Because
I was not going to lie. That.
I was expecting the no.
Yeah.
It depends, so cool.
Right. No, it's all of the above. I mean, I think when we're looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, because it is, when we pull back and look at the why, what the root causes behind our challenges, to ensuring that there's, significant and representative, that there's representation at every level in the organization. When we look at issues of equity and inclusion, a lot of times we're talking about deeply rooted systemic issues in our society, right? So it's not a simple 1-2 step solution, which I know all of my clients hate to hear, because they're like, we have problems, tell us what to do. And it's not that easy, but I think you really nailed it, Brett, that it is, we have to look at policies and practices and understand, how our HR documents, materials, employee manuals, for example, are indicating or not indicating that this is an inclusive environment, an equitable environment. So, for example, I know a lot of organizations that we're working with now have gone back to look at their documents, their policies, practices, their employee manuals, to make sure that they are being more inclusive and sensitive to members of the LGBTQ plus community, gender non-binary. So just thinking about the language is one sort of drop-down aspect. absolutely looking at trends in terms of complaints around harassment and discrimination. And even beyond that, I think looking at trends in terms of employee grievances around bullying or creating a hostile work environment. Because sometimes a lot of times what happens is there are more subtle acts of exclusion, those behaviors that might even be unintentional, but they don't rise to the legal definition of harassment or discrimination per se, but they're causing a chilling effect on people. And often it's people who are part of marginalized populations. Looking at trends in terms of recruitment and hiring. So I'm working with one organization right now where they did a deep dive into their data and into their HR data. And they found that, yes, we've widened the pool of candidates in terms of diversity. So we're bringing in and accepting more applications from a broader range of demographics. And yet, as we look at who continues down the road to the selection process, those numbers dwindle. And we see a pretty steady representation of, for example, in this organization, it's traditionally been white male dominated, and it continues to be white male dominated. And they said, we don't understand. It's not for a lack of trying. We're reaching out. We've got connections with, historically Black colleges and universities and tribal colleges and universities and so on and so forth. But we're not getting those folks across the finish line. And so that gave us an opportunity to drill down and say the challenge is not in terms of your recruitment efforts. The challenge is in the selection process. So now we have to focus on what sort of biases are we potentially bringing into the interviews, into the process of reviewing who should be put forth, in terms of seen as qualified. So definitely HR plays a really critical role in terms of understanding those elements. I think it's also a lot of times what we'll do is, in addition to employee culture surveys or climate surveys, asking questions specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion and how they feel that they are experiencing the organization. I think it's really important to do a more qualitative data gathering. So interviews, focus groups, dialogue sessions, talking with people and getting their stories. Again, going back to the importance of storytelling, there's such a richness in that. And often that's where you find some really valuable trends about how people are experiencing the organization differently.
Neato. So much to take in and to think about, on this particular topic. Your book title does, of course, include the phrase "for trainers." So, I mean, we've been talking here. You've been talking about, say, the hiring process and that broader HR. But there are opportunities, though, for us in the L&D space, the instructional design space, to start putting different practices in place, et cetera, too. So let's maybe move down into our zone here for a bit then. What are some of the things that we can do in our training and instructional design practice to start doing better at this?
There's so much. And I think that the reason that I chose to write this book in particular with a focus on folks in training and talent development is that trainers and instructional designers have the opportunity to touch so many people across the organization because they are designing, developing, delivering these learning experiences for folks across every level, across every job function. And so being able to embed these principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion into the training, not only making sure that any DEI-focused training is really solid and effective and leads to attitude and behavior change, but also how do we embed some of these principles into any training, regardless of the content, regardless of the topic? And so that, I think, is where we start to see that culture change element happen, because it just becomes a part of who we are. This is core to our language. It's front and center and present, rather than this other thing, this chore that we have to, that we have to do or we have to relegate to somebody else to do. It's more about all of us owning this, and it just becomes a part of what is. in the
It's kind of like
organizational
it's kind of like training and learning in general, right? We often complain about that as learning professionals or training professionals, that it's sometimes seen as separate from the business and the work and all that kind of stuff, right? But
Yeah.
we really try to encourage folks to create learning experiences and learning solutions that aren't just courses that are separate from things, but to do other types of learning content and embed it into the daily practice to be more holistic, I guess is the best word for it. And then taking it down that extra detail level, getting the diversity, equity, and inclusion into those practices, into that content is what we need to figure out. So let me ask again to drive it down another couple levels, and right, because I know that instructional, sometimes people think when we talk about DEI stuff, they think, oh, what are you guys going to talk about? Are you going to tell me to just make sure that when I get my clip art that I get people of all different ethnicities represented? Is that all is that all I have to do? I'm guessing there's more to it than that.
There's more to it.
So how can we do more than just the design stuff?
I'll give you some examples. I'll give you some ideas and then give you a couple of examples of real life organizations that I think are doing this very well. So yes, absolutely. It's, stepping back and thinking about the graphics, the images, not only in terms of visible representation of skin color diversity, and gender diversity, but also thinking about how are we representing people who are differently abled? How do we ensure that we're representing, to the extent that we can, religious diversity, cultural diversity? There's actually, there are a number of new websites that have come forth in the last couple of years that have photo galleries of trans and gender non-binary folks in daily life experiences and activities, right? So rather than, because a lot of times what's happened is that any images that you find of people who are trans or non-binary, it tends to be very narrowed, and it's not showing them just sort of as everyday folks. And so I think that's something to consider. Not only that, but also how are we showing these people? So for example, if we are referring to people in not only leadership positions, which oftentimes what we've seen, in the past, the go-to was always an older white male as the boss, as the CEO. And we've started seeing those elements change, but also in terms of job functions. So, for example, how often do you hear people refer to nurse and male nurse, right? Why do we have to gender the term nurse if it's a man? Because typically we've been so accustomed to thinking about nurses as women, right? Same with doctor, female doctor, so on and so forth. So I think just breaking that down and being very intentional about showing people in job functions that have historically been kind of atypical, that starts to change the narrative inside our brains. So that's one thing. The other thing is, who are we quoting? Who are we citing? Who is showing up on the videos that we show? For example, I've done leadership training for a number of years, and I would get so frustrated when I would either inherit someone else's training or be trying to do my own and looking for TED Talks or videos of women talking about leadership, or women CEOs talking about their role as leaders and what their advice would be. It's significantly, I think the top 25 leadership videos that show up when you do a search on the TEDx website are all white, and most of them are men. And typically the women who show up are folks like Brené Brown, who's talking about empathy. And so again, I love me some Brené Brown, but oftentimes what we see is that when women or people of color are represented in our training, for example, in leadership training, they are talking about these niche areas that often feel like they are perpetuating stereotypes as well. So I think we need to look a little bit more, a little deeper, and crowdsource with colleagues to find those ways to create new learning elements, to expose people to different voices and different perspectives with this work. There are so many ways in which, even, I don't know about you all, but it dawned on me a few years ago as I was listening to a fellow trainer giving some examples of, like those one-off scenarios that will often, give an example and say, well, Bob and Sally and Mary were having a conversation. It was like, why are all of the examples that we use, it's always Jim, Bob, Mary, and Sally? And so I actually did some research, some digging, and it turns out the Social Security Administration looked at the most popular baby names from 1920 to 2019. And wouldn't you know it, the top names were very Anglo, and it was, Robert, James, John, Mary, Sarah. So, it's not surprising when we think about it, also considering the fact that a vast majority of people in instructional design and training are highly educated, white, mostly female, a lot of times, right? So when we think about the perspective, the lenses that we're bringing with us as instructional designers, what our potential blind spots might be, it's not to, it's not to berate ourselves, but just to notice, who do I automatically represent because it just comes naturally to me, and who might I not be representing as effectively? So one example that I'll give you really quickly, I have a client that I've been working with. It's a global tech firm. They've got, folks all across the world. And a couple of years ago, they decided to develop some training programs. They wanted to have one that was specifically focused on DEI issues for their for the workforce in one particular division for everybody to take. They also wanted to do management training for all supervisors, but they really wanted to make sure that they were infusing these principles of DEI. So rather than making it diversity and inclusion for managers, they wanted to make it general manager training, but really undergird these principles of DEI. And so in both of those trainings, we made sure to include authors and and quotes from people who were representing diversity. And we also, in the case studies that they used, they made sure to include just names that represented global diversity, right? So it wasn't just names that were representing diverse folks in the United States, but also thinking about it more broadly. So I know that was a lot, but there's a lot that could potentially be done.
Well, you've mentioned a couple of times, stories, for instance, and I think, there are opportunities for us as we're thinking about moving away from John and Mary and Sally and Bob, et cetera, thinking who else's story, can we bring into this, as rather than simply saying whose name, or what name, maybe gives us an opportunity to more accurately, more what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, to better represent, I guess, and better to bring in, a wider range of perspectives from that perspective. Well, am I saying the right words? Yeah. Anyway, perspectives from perspectives. No, but I'm really hooked on the fact that you have used story a few times, and the ability for us to then leverage that as a tool for, creating empathy, creating understanding, moving beyond simply thou, more things that are more declamatory, like we're going to do this. Well, if we tell the story of how we're going to do this, there are the emotional ability of stories to also bring us to different places and understandings beyond just simply telling people the facts that we're going to do this or that. It feels very much like that's a very powerful tool for what we're trying to accomplish in this space.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I'd like to just toss in, I guess this would be kind of a question or maybe just a comment, but sometimes just like grabbing the stock images or whatever can be really easy. Sometimes I think it becomes a little bit too easy to just pick a name that's not Robert or John or Susie or whatever. And so we'll pick an ethnic name, but then the story that we're telling with that name doesn't necessarily match the culture that name might represent. And I think that part is hard for folks too, because we try really hard. At least I think the majority of our industry does really make a very, very concerned effort. But I have seen, like, the name dropped in, just changing the name. It's almost like swapping out Steve for Mohammed or something like that. But then the story that they're telling, it may be culturally inappropriate, I guess would be the best way I could put it. Maybe inappropriate's too strong of a word, but just doesn't fit, right? You just, you're reading through the story and it just doesn't make sense. So I wonder how we go about, doing that. I guess we could present it to others and say, hey, does this sound or does this feel right? Or, what are your thoughts on that? Have you seen it? Are there some tips we can offer folks?
Yeah, I agree with you, because just throwing the name in feels kind of like window dressing, especially if it's not put into an appropriate context.
Yeah.
And it's a fine balance, because we also want to make sure that we're not perpetuating stereotypes around different identity groups. So
I think that's why it's so hard. Yeah. I mean, that's right. If you use a female name, I got to come up with a story that I think is like a typically female thing. And it's like, well, really, do we want to do that? I mean, could we have a female diesel mechanic? Why not? Absolutely, we should, but people might feel a little hung up with that. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of crowdsourcing. I think finding cultural advisors, for lack of a better word. And that doesn't mean that we want to over rely on people who have been a part of minoritized communities who constantly are put in the position of having to explain to others why something is appropriate or inappropriate. But I do think developing relationships with other instructional designers, trainers who do come from diverse backgrounds, to be able to say, I'm trying to make sure that I have the context and the nuances right. Just like an author would, right? We have to we check our storyline if we're an effective author and we're writing a novel, with people who can say, let's tweak this a little bit so that it's more real. I think it's also considering the broader context of, if you're creating multiple stories or scenarios, how are people represented across the board? Because I think sometimes what happens is we'll have 3 or 4 scenarios, and we may see the same type of situations come out again and again, and that can cause some challenges. So for example, I'm very cognizant of how often, if I'm doing scenarios around micro messages, microaggressions, for example, that the aggressors are not constantly middle-aged white men, because the white guys in the training are going to be like, okay, so you're just telling me that I'm always the one at fault, and anybody can engage in these in these subtle acts of exclusion if they're in positions of power. So I think it's just kind of keeping that in mind too, as we're if we are portraying a woman in a leadership position who is potentially engaging in some behavior that's causing a challenge for her staff, then the next scenario should probably not also include a woman who's the problem or the aggressor, right? So just kind of thinking that through in the context of the multiple scenarios, but definitely find yourself some guides who are willing to be that trusted confidant, and kind of check yourself, check your work. I think it's also more broadly, this is, and we talked about this a little bit before we got into the interview. Christy mentioned, this is ongoing work, right? It's not like we hit the pinnacle of DEI and, it's yay, we're done. We are struggling with some basic instinctual human, ways of processing information. We're dealing with systemic challenges. So it's constantly reflecting, bringing that mindset of curiosity, not assuming that we have all the answers, and being willing to question, to grow, to challenge our own biases as instructional designers, as trainers, always looking for what might I be missing here.
Mm-hmm. Tom just threw a neat comment into the chat. During the pandemic, I recently had a friend conduct an audit of my social media activities. Whiter, staler, mailer was her assessment. I now look further afield for who I read and follow, and it's proving fruitful. So kudos to you, Tom, for taking that step and then taking the feedback to heart, and looking for breadth, etc. But it's true. We all have these. Not even you find somebody and then you follow somebody else in social media, etc., and you realize that it's all connected, by certain common denominators. From that perspective as well. Often DEI things or bias training, etc., are as you've said, it's not a singular one and done thing. We're not, everybody's taking the e-learning course, and look, we have a 97% average on the 20 question quiz that we had at the end of it. So therefore, it's done. We've fixed it. Everybody passed. So we're all. It is so much about changing things that are way bigger than any of us as individuals. Social structures, all the things that the baggages that we all carry forward as well. You are actually going to be sharing with us around this topic at the upcoming ATD. That's in May, right? The ATD ICE. I just wanted to flag that out there, that there's an off things for folks who haven't dealt in or want to improve their own processes, etc., to connect with you there, etc. Do you have is your ATD session a different topic than the book, or slightly different, or does it bring another angle to things than what's in the book?
It brings another angle in that it's specifically focusing on facilitation tools and tactics. And so for many folks who are in training, in the training profession, we don't necessarily learn how to facilitate. It's training on a particular skill set. There's some interaction, but facilitating is really this improvisational art form. And when we're talking about facilitating around identity, there's a lot of ways that can go sideways. So it's really a deep dive into what are some of the practices and techniques that we can leverage to get more comfortable wading into those uncomfortable conversations and helping people to kind of embrace the messiness of it.
So, wow. And in fact, I love the description of facilitation as improvisation, because you are, if you are truly, in that improvisational or in that facilitation mode, you have to be ready to, to react. You have to be nimble. You have to be, it's that Zen zone of being prepared and yet open to change, and all of those pieces. And that could be a very daunting task when we start moving down to these types of topics. It's one thing maybe to be thinking about making training programs and thinking about applying better filters, etc., for DEI, but then to be a person in the midst of a bunch of folks and potential emotions of a live situation compared to scenarios described in an e-learning course or something like that. That's really cool to be able to help people improve in that range too.
And you could have the most beautifully designed program, having done all the research and prepared, and maybe even having delivered it with success. And then you get into the room and there is a different dynamic in that audience. And very quickly, I have been in many situations where either I alone or co-facilitators and I have had to really dance in the moment and switch things up in order to meet the needs of the group and where they are in terms of, conflict, tension, power dynamics, perspectives that they're bringing with them into the space. Sometimes even considering external events that are happening. So, a training that worked 2 months ago might fall flat with a group because of something that has happened, conflict, social uprisings that have happened in the last week. And if we don't address it, people are going to be thinking about it and it can really fall flat. So really understanding how what's happening in the headlines is also impacting how people are showing up is incredibly important.
I think it's that room management, right? That I learned early on in my career, I think accidentally, from one of my colleagues in graduate school, came from the educational side of things, and she was a teacher. And she and I talked a lot about you have to manage, how you manage the room is as important as the topic and the things you're instructing them. Keeping kids focused and being attentive to all of them and understanding, feeling the tension that might be in the room. It's the same for adults. Just to your point, there's things going on in everybody's lives. There's things going on in the company. Then there's things going on in the external world. And when you get a room full of adults, you kind of have to be sensitive to that, and kind of, like you said, you gotta kind of sense the room and figure out where things are. And I think sometimes we get so excited as training professionals to get right to what we're going to do because we love our PowerPoint slide and we want to show people, and we want them to learn, and we're really excited about being successful at what we're doing. But then you feel this sense in the room and you want to get started. But sometimes I think taking 10 minutes and just giving people a chance to kind of dial in, right? And I think that's where icebreaker activities come in and are successful. I know people roll their eyes when I say the term, maybe they should be called something else. But I think in general, what I'm saying is that giving folks an opportunity to become present in the moment, I think is going to help everything. And
And that's such a critical element in the design process too, is thinking about how we build and maintain psychological safety throughout the course of the session or the training, and establishing giving people the opportunity to sort of dip their toes in the water of vulnerability and then slowly get into the deep end, because I've been a part of and I've seen trainers who have thrown people in the deep end without their swimmies when they're not ready for it.
Yeah.
And that can lead to so much extra time and effort to have to sort of clean that up and get people to a place, if you can, because folks withdraw, right? They're like, I don't want to go in there again. And so it does take some thoughtfulness in terms of how are we going to set this up so that people can get more comfortable in this group dynamic, can feel as though when we say this is a safe space to talk about things, we really mean it. And make sure when we're thinking about it from a design perspective that we're building in the time that it really takes for that to happen.
Yeah, for sure.
We have one question in the question panel that we'll jump to. Buddy is asking, we use surveys a lot for our trainings for level 1 assessments. So the classic, post-training survey. And I recently brought up what I perceived as an issue with this practice. My thought was that since surveys in general look for mass appeal rather than specific voices, it can easily gloss over the experience or opinion of marginalized groups. Furthermore, it helps maintain the status quo. So are there other things that we can do to have learners provide us with feedback or to provide an assessment of a course, and even ways to get information better from that kind of a post-training or a post-experience survey?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think that's spot on. A lot of times what we see, especially with DEI-focused training, is that the training goes well, and a number of the folks who are part of the dominant identity group are like, I learned so much, and I got a chance to share, and I feel great about this, happy smiley sheet. And then the folks who have been, banging on the doors saying, we need to be talking about this for a very long time, because they're the ones on the receiving end. Some of them may feel vindicated, but others often bring the skepticism of, I don't think much is going to change. This felt like it made certain folks feel really good or learn something, but what about me? And so I really think that it has to be, the training has to be connected to broader strategic goals to address some of the issues that hopefully have been discovered in a broader organizational survey, even before we do the smiley sheet surveys. A lot of organizations over the past few years have incorporated not only DEI strategic plans or strategic goals into their corporate planning, but also individual performance expectations, especially for people in leadership and management positions, to demonstrate certain competencies and behaviors that are aligned with DEI. And so that's where I think you start to see, thinking about our friends, the Kirkpatrick model of evaluation, that's where you start to see some of that when there's behavior change, when there are some significant organizational changes that lead to people feeling that sense of inclusion who haven't before, better retention rates of folks from minoritized identity groups. So when we can kind of focus on the end result that we're trying to achieve and then make sure that we're setting it up, the training is typically not going to be the one thing that leads to those results. Those are
it never is, right?
It never is, right? It's a contributing factor. And so I think to the point that our audience member made, it's making sure that this is very explicitly aligned with broader organizational goals, and then continuing to do pulse checks with folks across the organization and looking for any demographic variances in the way that people are experiencing the organization is key.
And I think
Very
that
cool.
is a fantastic place for us to start wrapping things up. We could probably talk about this forever, actually. There is so much around DEI that I think we're just scratching the surface. But I appreciate you, Maria, for being here, taking the challenge on, and starting to scratch that surface for us.
Yeah, and go ahead and toss in any info there into the chat where people can connect with you. And I think we talked too about the innovation at ATD ICE, not just the session, but there's also a book signing. So if folks want to pick up a copy and they're at the at ATD, they can get you to even sign it too, personalize it. That's brilliant. As always, folks, Domino Learning Systems sponsors this opportunity that we have to talk to some amazing people here on instructional designers in offices drinking coffee. And if it's of interest to you, you can check out that little green button down below our screen to learn a bit more about Domino One. And also, Brent's posted in the info to connect with us on our Idiotic LinkedIn group and continue the conversation there. Stay connected and keep up to date on the next things that we're going to talk about. Maria, thanks so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. It's been an awesome conversation, and we definitely appreciate you coming here to share your thoughts on this with us. And I'm sure we'll catch up again with you soon. And in the meantime,
Maria.
Folks, have a great time dancing into the rest of your Wednesday, folks. Bye, gang.
Big finish. Adios, everybody.